So we'll start off with a little bit of background. Under the Planning Act, the city is required to undertake regular reviews of the official plan, which is a policy document to guide the growth and development of the city to ensure that policies are consistent with current provincial legislation plans and policies. The city's current review process has been divided into two phases. Phase 1 of the review was adopted by Council on June 26, 2018, and approved with modifications by the province on April 26, 2019. These changes dealt with a number of policies, including growth and settlement, lake water quality, climate change, planning for an aging population, and local food. Some of these amendments to the official plan required implementation through the zoning bylaw, those relating in particular to shoreline development, the shopping center commercial zone, the limited general commercial zone, and farm consolidation related provisions in the zoning bylaw. So I'll provide a brief overview of each change and then we'll open it up to questions. So starting off with farm consolidation. In agricultural areas, there are limitations on where lots can be created in order to preserve farmland. Where two large agricultural lots are merged together through a farm consolidation, and each of the two lots contain an existing dwelling, one of those surplus farm dwellings is permitted to be severed, provided that the new lot will be limited to a minimum size that to accommodate the existing dwelling, well and septic system, and it must meet other provisions that are provided for in the official plan, including it must meet minimum distance separation requirements from adjacent livestock operations. The proposed amendment to the zoning bylaw would eliminate the need for rezoning of these surplus dwelling lots, provided that they meet certain size requirements. So the provisions that we're proposing in the zoning bylaw are to establish a minimum lot area of 0.4 hectares, a maximum lot area of 1 hectare, and a minimum lot frontage of 45 meters. This diagram just illustrates an example of a farm consolidation. So you'll see two large abutting farm properties, each containing an existing dwelling, and the dashed area is just showing an approximation of what a surplus farm dwelling severance would look like. The next change pertains to the C4 or limited general commercial zone. This zone is essentially the shoulder area between the downtown and surrounding areas. The amendments to the official plan require both a minimum and a maximum height limit for this shoulder area to the central business district. At present in the zoning bylaw, there is a maximum height of 34 meters in the C4 zone. The proposed amendment to the zoning bylaw would introduce a minimum height of 8.0 meters in the C4 zone, which is consistent with the minimum height standard in the C6 downtown commercial zone. And this amendment will provide for an appropriate transition of height between the downtown and adjacent areas. The next proposed amendment is not directly related to phase 1 of the official plan review, but rather to recent projects that were undertaken related to the LaSalle Corridor Study official plan amendment and changes that were made to the bylaw that introduced permission for long-term care facilities, retirement homes, and multiple dwellings as permitted uses within the C5 zone. The proposed amendment would remove the current maximum lot coverage of 50%, as well as removing the maximum gross floor area, which is limits the gross floor area to 100% of the lot area. These amendments will provide more flexibility for the redevelopment of C5 properties. The current provisions in the zoning bylaw for parking and loading, as well as minimum requirement of 15% for landscape open space, will provide sufficient limitation on lot coverage on these sites. Those provisions, combined with site plan control, will be used to achieve high quality design on these sites. The last set of amendments deal with shoreline development. So a key focus of phase 1 of the 5-year review of the official plan was the protection of our lakes. And while the official plan already contains policies to protect sensitive groundwater features, these policies were further strengthened through the review. Key changes were a proposed amendment establishing a setback for development from a lake or river of 30 meters, which is an increase from the current 12 meters. Shoreline structures such as saunas, docks, pumps, boathouses will still be permitted within this setback area. A setback of 12 meters will remain in place for permanently flowing streams. The second shoreline related amendment deals with septic systems. So it is proposed that the zoning bylaw will now establish a requirement of 30-meter setback for leaching beds adjacent to lakes, rivers, as well as streams. The third proposed amendment related to shoreline development will increase the shoreline buffer area, which is the naturally vegetated area adjacent to the water body. And it will be increasing from the current 12 meters to 20 meters, abutting lakes and rivers. Again, adjacent to streams, this buffer requirement will remain at 12 meters. The policies related to the amount of shoreline buffer area that may be cleared of natural vegetation haven't changed. So this is the natural area adjacent to the water body where you can have shoreline structures. Again, those are things like your docks and saunas. So the associated bylaw provisions allow for a clearing of a maximum of 25% of the buffer area, not to exceed 276 meters square or 23 meters in length, whichever is the lesser. So the city does recognize that there are a number of existing lots in the city that may not be able to develop or redevelop in accordance with these new requirements. This slide demonstrates what the 30-meter setback would look like along one of our water bodies. So that's indicated by the red buffer area. So that's showing the 30-meter setback. The yellow represents a 20-meter setback from the 30-meter buffer. And this was used to demonstrate what was estimated to be a sufficient building envelope outside of the required setback area. So it's an additional 20 meters, which would account for a 7.5 meter setback from the road, as well as a building envelope of approximately 12.5 meters. And the green represents the remaining area of land on the lot. So if it's a lot that's showing green, there should be sufficient area to develop outside of the required setback. We do recognize again that there are a number of lots that are smaller in size than the current lot standards and that have existing structures that are currently located within the 30-meter shoreline setback. There are options for dealing with non-complying situations that allow people to reconstruct or make additions. The zoning bylaw currently contains those provisions. And what I'll go through in the next slide is just a couple of development scenarios. So in scenario A, you can see that the existing structure is fully within the 30-meter required setback, and additionally is partially within the required 20-meter shoreline buffer area. In this instance, if an addition were proposed, you can see that it would be partially within the 30-meter required setback and partially outside of the setback. In this instance, a minor variance to the zoning bylaw would likely be required as a portion of the addition is within that required setback area. Versus a scenario such as scenario B, where the existing dwelling is located partially within the required 30-meter setback and partially outside of the setback, and the addition is fully outside of the required setback area. In that instance, provided that another minor variance for something such as exceeding maximum lot coverage, in that if another variance was not identified, you would not require a variance for that addition specifically. So this question came up last night. So just to provide a bit of additional clarification, the shoreline buffer area setback is 20 meters, whereas the new setback for development, so that includes your primary structures such as your cottage, as well as larger accessory structures such as garages or sheds, things that are not directly related to use of the water body, are required to be set back the 30 meters from the shoreline. Staff does understand that there will be a period of transition, and we will be working with property owners, building services, the Nickel District Conservation Authority, and the health unit as these new provisions to the zoning bylaw are implemented. So that's the end of the presentation, and we'll now open it up to questions.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So again, if you have any questions, anything Melissa's discussed here, or anything related to this presentation, then go ahead and click on the little guy at the top of your screen with the hand up, just to raise your hand, or click on the little chat bubble, and then you can ask your question in there. Okay, our first question is from P. Lainala. Go ahead and unmute your mic, please.
Yeah, sure. It's Tommy, just for the record. So I just have I have a few questions, but maybe I'll start the, entice people that have similar ones maybe to come forward as well. But a couple of the things is what's the basis for increasing the setback? Like it's a significant increase from I believe 12.5 in the existing for building to now 30. And I appreciate the example that Melissa showed on a subdivision or a development on a point. The lot fabrics typically follow lots and concession lines, and there are some lots and parcels that have really narrow sections along shorelines, and that 30 meters would effectively sterilize a lot of portions of potential development along those areas, and it would make it tricky for somebody to look at developing that parcel with the 30-meter setback. So just trying to get a sense of how that 30-meter setback was chosen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll start off by providing a bit of a history in terms of the amendment process that we went through over the past few years. So every 5 years, the city's required to update the official plan. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key focuses of the current review of the official plan was greater protection of our water bodies. The current provincial standard with respect to setbacks is 30 meters. And the city was aware that the province would likely be moving in that direction. So in our original proposal, we had submitted to the ministry a proposed setback of 20 meters, which we had viewed as a bit more of an interim step, knowing that in the future they'd be going towards the 30 meters. And the 20 meters was what the council had approved. However, the ministry is actually the approval authority, and they modified our proposed 20 meters up to the 30-meter setback. So that's how we ended up with that particular number. And I didn't know, Stephen, if you wanted to add a little bit about maybe the science behind the 30-meter setback.
Yeah, just to add a bit. So the general rule of thumb is that from human activities, so the separation of human activities from lakes is generally, and we're talking about, just basically, setting up lawns and washing cars, et cetera, is the wider the separation, the better. And of course, that means that, 10 meters is better than 5 meters, 30 meters is better than 10 meters, 100 meters is better than 30 meters. But in order to find a reasonable separation, a reasonable setback, that given that, there's a lot of people that still want to live around lakes, is in terms of the compromise that was met in terms of the amount of ecological services that you're gaining with 30 meters, that seemed for many to be a reasonable setback to provide, supported, of course, by the science showing that there are greater filtration services provided by a 30-meter setback. There's more wildlife habitat if a good portion of that is left in its natural state, and it's a general ecological benefit to the aquatic ecosystem. So that's through literature reviews in the United States, in Canada, Ontario, and specifically, and it has been the ministry's position for a number of years to have that setback at 30 meters. So that's where the 30 meters originates.
Does that answer your question?
Well, I can do a follow-up now or later. It doesn't matter to me because I realize that somebody else has their hand up as well.
That's okay. You can do a follow-up. Just, Melissa, you're sharing your Word document. I'm not sure if you're aware if you wanted to share your PowerPoint or not. But yeah, go ahead with a follow-up now that we're on the topic.
Yeah, okay. So, I understand what Stephen was saying. And, given that the incremental step and, potentially that it's going to the provincial setback, I appreciate the city was looking at something smaller, right? Because I know that there was historically some draft plans of subdivision done with the 20 meters. I don't know if any of them have been built, but there was one that was lapsed that I know of personally. And I appreciate the increasing setback from the development zone on the lake. But when you look at the development throughout the city, a lot of that hasn't been effectively enforced. Even in newer subdivisions where you can see lawn right up to the road, to the lake shore. So is more the enforcement be more on the 25% and the natural setback rather than setting the property back? Because there's mitigative measures that you can put in to stop, say, your eaves trough from running straight into the lake to reduce that impacts directly to the water. Right. So that's just my thought on there. It seems like there's opportunities that you can probably engineer a lot of those concerns or some of those concerns that you have out of the picture, so to speak.
Right. So I think I'll just speak a little bit about perhaps the enforcement approach with the city. So generally speaking, through the lake stewardship groups and city staff, the approach has been more of an education approach, more of a carrot approach to try and encourage people to maintain the majority of their vegetation or natural vegetation along the shoreline. And enforcement of instances where people may have cleared more than is permitted by the zoning bylaw, it's done on a complaints basis. So a complaint could be submitted to 311, which would be an anonymous complaint, which would be followed up with our bylaw enforcement staff, perhaps in collaboration with staff from building services, planning services, and the conservation authority. And they would be come involved to determine how best to rectify the situation on the site. But again, it is on a complaints basis.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Our next question is from Elaine. Go ahead, Elaine. You can unmute your mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, good. I have two questions, if that's okay. One is, what are the different definitions for a buffer and a setback? Is one more vegetation oriented? What can be grown in one or the other, or what are the differences in use between a setback and a buffer?
So maybe I can address that, Melissa. So the setback is simply the distance between the high water mark on the lake and whatever structure is being proposed, or it could be anything else really. It's just a setback, literally a linear measurement. Whereas the other is a vegetated buffer. So the idea here, and the way it's defined in the zoning bylaw, is it's aimed at natural vegetation, including natural rocks that might occur in that vegetation. So that's what's understood as the shoreline buffer per se.
So in a setback, no structures can be built, but there are no other specifications.
Well, there are certain structures that can be built, and that's again specified in the zoning bylaw, and they would be typically shoreline structures, like you can think of. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Melissa. I'm the one that's walking on thin ice, but things like a sauna, things like a boathouse, the structures that are directly associated to shoreline activities. So that does not include like a utility shed, for example, or a garage or things like that.
I see. Thank you. And I just would like to ask too, do these specifications apply to buildings that are pending and have been approved and are pending and have not yet been built? These new zoning requirements, or do old zoning requirements apply to those approvals but not built structures?
So with respect to timing, if you are in the midst of the building approval process, the zoning bylaw provisions that are in place at the time of your approval or in effect at the time of your approval are the ones that would be in effect. So in order to build under the current zoning bylaw standards, you would have to have an approved building permit or some other approval such as an approved minor variance. Otherwise, you would be subject to the new setback requirements once they come into force. One thing I should maybe note perhaps is that where we are with respect to the timeline of these provisions coming into effect. So these open houses are being held in advance of a public hearing, which is where planning committee will actually be making the decision whether or not to approve these proposed amendments. Once that decision is made by planning committee, it must be ratified by council at a subsequent meeting, after which we prepare a bylaw, which then goes back to council for approval. Once the bylaw is approved, there is a 20-day statutory appeal period, after which the bylaw actually comes into effect. So all in all, in terms of timing, we're probably looking more at September before these provisions take effect. So if you're in the development process, it may be that you will be able to obtain your building a permit or approval prior to these provisions coming into force and effect.
Okay, thank you. And if we have comments about that, we can make them to the city in response.
That's correct. So there's a few different means by which you can submit your comments. If you would like them to formally be considered by planning committee, you can contact our clerk's department. On our Over to You webpage, which Kelly mentioned earlier, there is a link to the public notice, which provides all the information as to how you can participate in the public process. So there's a few different options there. One, you can submit written comments to clerks, or alternatively, you can request to clerks to make oral submissions and speak at the planning committee meeting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thanks for your questions. We appreciate them, Elaine. Next, we have a hand up from what looks like a returning customer. So NWITTKE, which go ahead and unmute your
Nicole. Nicole.
Okay, it's not Nicole speaking, but hello. If a contractor is asked to modify the shoreline by a homeowner, is the homeowner or the contractor required to get a permit to modify the shoreline? And who is liable if a complaint is lodged by calling 311 by a neighbor?
Well, maybe I can address the permit issue. So yes, a permit is required. A permit would be required from Conservation Sudbury, as well as more than likely a permit from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry for modification of the shoreline. Certainly if there's any importation of material into the lake, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry would be involved. There's a potential even for Department of Fisheries and Oceans to be involved. Conservation Sudbury is a good first port of call for those kinds of situations. So if somebody's looking to make a hard edge to their shoreline, they would be the ones to contact. Removal of vegetation, a certain amount of aquatic vegetation, whether they're invasive vegetation or not, would still requires a permit from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So there's a number of things, and as you can kind of surmise from what I'm discussing here, there's a number of it's shoreline and the water's edge has always been through a distributed portfolio. So the municipality has certain responsibilities. The conservation authorities have certain responsibilities. Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, as well as Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So it depends exactly what is being contemplated by a proposal. And as I said, Conservation Sudbury is a good first port of call because they have historically experience working with both the MNRF and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Okay, and if the if no permit is pursued and construction begins or change on the shoreline occurs, what happens?
Well, I would certainly have a conversation with Conservation Sudbury as a first point of contact and seek the advice there, because as I said, if it is directly on the shoreline, then that would be something where they would be first involved.
Okay, and so they would be involved when the when 311 would be called, right, to make them aware of the situation.
Well, that would be a call. I'm not sure how our 311 functions, whether they do call, whether they do have a link to directly to Conservation Sudbury. Perhaps Kelly, do you know that?
Yeah, I do know that. So no, so Conservation Sudbury works with the city, but is not a part of the city.
Right.
I can look up the phone number for you now, and maybe I'll post it in the little chat window.
Yeah, it's a 674 number for sure. So 705-674. I just can't remember it offhand. And they would be called, and you would be reaching them directly.
Yes, I'm just pulling it up right now on my computer here. Conservation Sudbury, contact us, and that is 674-5249 to contact Conservation Sudbury.
Okay, and further question is, if the homeowner refuses, let's say they started construction prior to any change as of June 28th, I would assume. Well, no, I mean, they're already started construction now without a permit, then and if Conservation Sudbury was contacted and the homeowner refused to remove the structure or the change on the shoreline that you know, with additional rocks and sand, et cetera, then what happens in terms of enforcement?
Well, again, that would be a conversation that you would want to have with Conservation Sudbury. It depends exactly on the situation, how egregious they view that situation, and they would take the steps. There's no assurance that they would ask them to remove the material. They may ask them to go through a proper permit so that Conservation Sudbury can have a fuller idea as to what's being contemplated. The other ministry that might be involved, of course, is the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So there's regulations under that as well. So again, it depends exactly what's being contemplated. It's rarely, I would say, it's rarely a situation where if they haven't got a permit, they immediately need to remove everything and then start from scratch. So it's probably a compromise situation where they're, you know, through a lot of education and communication, they're going to basically trying to surmise the situation and determine how severe the situation is. In some instances, though, it may result in the removal of some or all of that material.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Oh, we got one more here. Hang on. Just wants to come in at the same time and ask a question. Okay, Alistair, you are next. Go ahead and unmute your mic.
Okay. Yeah, I'm on one of the lake stewardship committees in Sudbury, and I'm just wondering, do you have an idea of how many existing properties in the city would be in non-compliance? Because I'm suspecting it's be a really large number of property owners. So my concern would be, you know, even it sounds to me like if you were even wanting to erect a garden shed, you'd have to apply for a variance. Is that correct? Even if it was below the, I think it's 8 by 10 is the current, you need a building permit. But if it was smaller than that, so I guess there's two questions there. Do we have a sort of an inventory of existing properties that would be in non-compliance?
Mm-hmm. No, so the answer to that question is no, we haven't done a detailed inventory to determine the exact number of properties that may not comply with current setback requirements. The expectation is that where there are, you know, we recognize that there are a number of lots that may be smaller in size, historically created, and it may not be possible to develop in such a way that all of your primary structures are set beyond that 30-meter setback. So there are provisions in the zoning bylaw that allow for reconstruction, repair, or replacement of existing structures that are within that setback. And if you're not increasing the gross floor area of your structures, there may not be a need for a minor variance. If, however, it's an addition and you're significantly increasing the gross floor area, or if you're adding a new structure within that setback area, there may be a need for a minor variance. What staff does look at in those instances is an assessment as to the specific characteristics of the site. So are there constraints? Is it deficient in size or area? Is it a particularly narrow lot? Are there any specific topographical features on the lot that would prevent you from building in compliance with the zoning bylaw? So all of those things are taken into consideration when staff are reviewing those applications.
Oh, okay, and the second part of my question was if a structure that currently doesn't require a permit, is that would it still apply to that? Like I say, an 8 by 8 garden, like a tool shed, for example.
Mm-hmm. That actually is a good question that perhaps maybe building services could better answer, because they generally, what happens when you apply for a building permit, they would be the ones to review. I would suggest though that the zoning bylaw, regardless of whether you require a building permit, based on the zoning bylaw, you would be required to meet that setback if it's not an accessory structure that could be considered for shoreline use. You know, one of the shoreline structures that I'm thinking of that is permitted are those that are related to pump-like structures. So to store your pump equipment. So if it's something like that is related to shoreline use, that may be permitted. If it's something, a smaller structure, say to store your lawnmower or other equipment, that should be set outside of the 30-meter setback, whether or not that structure would trigger the need for a building permit.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alistair, for your question. Elaine, you have another question. Go ahead and unmute your mic.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I'm just wondering about the process by which these zoning changes were determined in all of, I mean, how were the bylaws reviewed, and how was it determined that some would be changed and not others changed? And a sort of auxiliary question to that is, was climate change, I believe I read that climate change was not a consideration in determining which bylaws needed to be changed.
Okay, so at the beginning of the presentation, I'll just go back a little bit to refresh everybody as to the history as to how these amendments to the zoning bylaw came to be. So we began a review process for the official plan, which is the overarching policy document that guides growth and development in the city in 2012. And those policy updates pertain to a number of different topic areas, including climate change, housing, growth and development. So all of those amendments were considered and implemented and ultimately adopted by council and approved by the ministry in 2019. Not all of those policy changes that occurred as part of the official plan review and now our policy in that official plan document resulted in the need for an amendment to the zoning bylaw. Only those that are listed in the presentation today, so the ones pertaining to the C5 zone, the C4 zone, farm consolidation, as well as these shoreline provisions required an amendment to the zoning bylaw. So items such as climate change are more policy type issues that have been addressed in the official plan, but those aren't items that can be addressed through an amendment to the zoning bylaw.
You said they cannot or they can be?
They are not, they're not an issue that's addressed through zoning bylaw provisions.
I see. And these are provisions that were, I still don't know where they exactly originated. So they're left over from when you applied for the changes initially in 2012. These were ones that had not appeared there or were rejected by the province, or I'm not sure how you ended up with these 4 areas.
Great. So I'll take another stab, and then I see my colleague Ed popping up here who might be able to assist too. But so we're talking about two different documents. So the 4 proposed amendments that we're talking about today are changes to the zoning bylaw, which deals with very specifically with what uses are permitted on land within certain zones within the city of Greater Sudbury, as well as provisions that apply to those particular uses. So very technical things such as setbacks, height minimums and maximums, those types of things, versus the official plan, which is a broader policy document and deals with a wider, more overarching policy type issues. For example, things like climate change. The zoning bylaw is one document that implements some of the policies. So not every policy that sits in the official plan, it's not appropriate to implement each of those provisions through the zoning bylaw. There can be other mechanisms to implement those types of policies. For example, the community energy and efficiency plan, that would be one of the means by which we implement our climate change policies, for example. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to add to that response.
All I would say, thank you, that's the clarification between policy and implementation. It seems to me that the buffer zone is an implementation of climate change. It reduces flow of water, excess water into the lake. So it does do that. They're connected. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would add to that even kind of the farm consolidation policies and the local food policies. So not directly climate change, but a lot of these are complementary. And I would add to what Melissa was saying too, as far as what was being reviewed. So part of that is, you know, as she was saying, we're required to review our official plan every 5 years because there's new provincial policies, there's new local circumstances. So as part of the official plan, we do a number of background studies, population predictions, that kind of stuff, transportation studies. And then we take a look at the official plan, what needs to be updated. And then from there, we have to implement that through the zoning bylaw, like Melissa was saying. So our zoning bylaw is from 2010, so it still has a lot of how would I call that? it's still relatively recent, and as part of this review, we're kind of updating the what's specifically needed to be updated with the official plan.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Is it Tommy, I believe? You have another question?
Yes, it is. Actually, I got two. Well, one small one, I think that'll be relatively easy to answer. But maybe I'll
Go
be
ahead.
the last one to answer questions or ask questions. But so the 30, what's the definition? I believe it was a creek or river. Is there a definition of that? You know, there's some pretty significant drainage courses in the valley. You know, probably some smaller than what would be some of the ditch, you know, creeks or stream systems that connect lakes in the south end.
Yeah, so
and yeah, sorry, is that
Oh,
so
go
is that
ahead,
30
Tom.
meters per side, or is it 30 meters like total width?
Right. So perhaps, Melissa, I can answer that one. So as you can imagine, what you said is very correct. There is a huge diversity of drainage courses as well as lakes. So we had to, how a river is defined for the purposes of the official plan, and therefore the purposes of the zoning bylaw, which implements the official plan, is that a river is the main channel of one of the three principal rivers in our area. So the Wanapitei, the Onaping, and the Vermilion. Everything else, again, only for the purposes of the official plan and the zoning bylaw, is considered a stream. And the setback from the stream is 12 meters on either side of the stream bank.
Okay, great, thanks. That's good clarity, right? So and then in terms of the setbacks only apply to residential properties. Am I correct? The 30 meters, or does it apply to all development?
So those changes are a general provision, which means that it applies to any property that's abutting a water body. So these are general to all shoreline development.
Okay. So yes, I missed that. I thought it was just specific to residential, but now understanding that, you know, obviously going against the provincial mandate of 30 meters is a bit more challenging for the city to say go with a lower standard. What's the bar for a bylaw variance set for that? Like if you needed to encroach, like your example that you showed, Melissa, where you had that point, and maybe the point was 5 meters narrower, and all of a sudden that you've basically sterilized half that point that you can develop it. Would that be an area that would be considered for like a bylaw variance? And maybe it's not a minor variance, and I don't know the difference. It's just a term I heard you use. But would it be contemplated, or is it strictly straight off the books that not allowed at that point?
Right. And that can be a challenging question to answer. I would say it's not a strict mathematical formula where you say automatically, you know, a request to be set back 10 meters versus 30 is an automatic no. Every property has different characteristics. It's not the intent of the city to sterilize development on properties. So everything would be evaluated giving consideration to the site specific circumstances. So, you know, considering that, you know, if you have a lot that, you know, in certain instances, they've been created back in the 30s or 40s, and it may actually only be 30 meters in lot depth. We would work with you in terms of looking at what the request is for that particular site and work to, you know, to a resolution to some reasonable request that doesn't fully limit development and complies as best you can on that particular site. So if you're looking to reconstruct, you know, consideration would be given to, or, you know, are there any constraints on the property? You know, continuing to build generally within the same building envelope, and complying as best you can. But no, the intent really is not to sterilize or prevent people from being able to say, add a deck to their property or make small additions or to reconstruct on the property. We're definitely willing to work with people on those types of applications.
No, yeah, thank you. It's just, the way things read is sometimes they read as absolutes, and it's always nice to know what mechanisms are there. And I understand that that's the role of the planning committee, or the city planners, right, is to work with people there. So thanks for that.
I believe our official plan also has the considerations that would be given for those that would be seeking a variance to the zoning bylaw. Right. So topography, for example, there are situations where a person would like to put on an addition to an old camp that was built. And there's literally a rock outcrop right out, like, towards the roadside, I guess, rather than the water side. So they're really compromised as to where they can put an addition. So those types of considerations are brought before the Committee of Adjustment in order to help them, understand the circumstances of that particular application. There's other applications that wouldn't meet any of those considerations. So somebody just says, no, I want my house, everything on the lot is perfectly equal, it's flat, smooth, and they say, no, I want to be within 5 meters of the lake. Well, as you can imagine, that would be considered as not very, like, it doesn't meet any of the considerations that would be given in order to approve that variance. Right? It's just somebody's wanting to build closer to the water. That doesn't really meet any tests.
So in that case, they would be looking for a rezoning then at that point, and then it would go to council instead of a minor variance process.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks, Ed.
So the tool is still there. It's just a zoning bylaw amendment, a bit more involved, but just a heads up on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you guys have had some great questions. Does anybody else have any questions? We're here until 7, so yeah, and again, if you think of something that you haven't asked today and you think about it later tonight or tomorrow or whenever, you can go over to u.greatersudbury.ca. We do have information up on that website about this specific project, and there is a place where you can ask your questions. It sends us an email and lets us know, and then you can, we'll get back to you with that kind of answer. So if if you want to stick around until, I don't know, what time is it? It's been so much fun. So we have another 8 minutes. If you want to stick around, then you can do that. Otherwise, thank you guys for joining us. But we'll stick around until 7 o'clock. And if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. Thus begins the awkward silence and city staff staring at each other on the screen. So for 7 minutes.
Hello, Krishnan. Thank you for joining us. Recognize your name.
Hi, sorry, I was in the meeting, and it was just nice to hear about all these things. I missed the first couple of minutes or so, but I think it was capped very well, so thank you for that.
I've asked Melissa if she would come to our next watershed advisory panel meeting to give a presentation as well. So.
Oh, that'd be great. Actually, when is the next watershed? I had to miss the last watershed. There was a family emergency, and I don't know when the next one's scheduled for. Do you remember it off the top of your head, Stephen?
I believe it's July 15th.
July 15th. Okay, perfect.
Sorry,
Melissa,
we're having an INSEE conversation. Sorry.
no, I noticed that. That's, you know, Waterford. I think it's sort of on topic. It's fine. Melissa, if you wanted to maybe do a little wrap up and let people know how they can contact you, should they have any questions. I think there's a central email system or whatnot, and we could sort of wrap things up then.
Sure. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Just a bit of a recap in terms of the process that we're undertaking. So again, this is one of 2 open house sessions. This is the second session. And these 2 open houses are leading up to a public hearing. So Planning Committee will be considering the proposed amendments at the meeting of June 28th at 1 p.m. If you're looking for additional information, we do have an Over to You website set up with information related to these proposed amendments. So I believe a copy of the bylaw is up there, as well as previous staff reports, as well as the notice of public hearing. If you are interested in participating in the public hearing, you can contact Clerk Services, and you can either submit something in writing, or if you wish, you can register with clerks to actually speak at the public meeting. Alternatively, if you think of any additional questions that you might have after this evening's session, our or email addresses for both Ed Landry and myself are posted on that the Over to You webpage. And we're happy to answer any follow-up questions. And again, just thank you very much for joining us and having an interest in this topic.
Elaine, you have a wrap-up question for us?
Yes, I do. It's a wrap-up question. I'm asking whether or not how we can just be as in the audience for the Planning Committee meeting if we don't have anything we want to present. Are we still able to be there at the meeting itself?
I'll take this one, actually. So all of our council and committee meetings are broadcast live, and you can see a calendar of all those meetings, and you can watch it right live on your computer from wherever you are, and that's at greatersudbury.ca/agendas. It'll give you a nice calendar. What date is this one on, Melissa?
June 28th.
June 28th, yes.
June 28th. So if you go to greatersudbury.ca/agendas, you'll see on June 28th a link to the live broadcast, which will come up as soon as we start. So
again, to confirm, to confirm though, that's not a council meeting. It's actually a committee of council called the Planning Committee, and it would start at 1 p.m.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I think that wraps everything up. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, just let us know, and hopefully we cleared up some things for you today, and we look forward to doing some more of these virtual meetings with our friends in planning. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much for coming, everyone. Thanks, Kelly, for hosting.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.